Greetings and welcome to Train Signal. You're watching Microsoft Lync Server 2013 Edge Services. In order to gain a good understanding of how Carverock Fitness has its Edge environment set up and how the clients from outside of the corporate boundaries are going to connect into Lync, we want to start off with a tour of the external client types and what functionality will be provided to them. Now, when we look at the term external clients, with Microsoft Lync, that is a broad term that is used to refer to different types of clients that are authorized to connect into your Microsoft Lync environment to communicate, coming across your DMZ, or more specifically, coming across your Lync Edge server and your reverse proxy server out in your DMZ. The first category of external clients that we have is labeled remote users. And I know in most corporate environments, when you think of a remote user, you're thinking about somebody that connects in through a VPN, like Cisco or a Nortel solution or something like that. When we look at Microsoft Lync, a remote user would be somebody connecting in to gain access to your Lync environment coming across the Edge server. So for example, if I have a user that works for the organization and maybe they're out at training or out at a conference this week, and while they're out at the conference, they open up their laptop, they launch their Lync client, and they connect coming in across the internet. When that user connects coming in across the internet, they're coming in through the reverse proxy server and also the Edge server out in your DMZ. The second category of external clients would be federated users. Federated users are people that work for another company, so they don't have a user account within our environment. But what we do have is a trust relationship between our Microsoft Lync Edge services and their corporate Lync Edge services as well. So it does require that they have a version of unified communication and that they set up their side of the trust relationship like we do over here on our side. You also want to keep in mind that just because you have a trust relationship with another organization, it doesn't mean that we do not have any control over the type of traffic going across the DMZ. When you look at the feature set that is provided or available to the federated users, it's kind of similar to that of a remote user where they can participate in instant messaging. They have access to presence information. They can participate in peer-to-peer and also multi-party conferences. But again, we can lock that down. Microsoft Lync also supports what's called PIC Federation, Public Instant Messaging Connectivity Federation relationships with external instant messaging providers, such as AOL, Yahoo, and MSN. In order to set up public instant messaging connectivity from your internal environment out onto the internet, it requires that you go through what's called a PIC provisioning process. If you go out to the Microsoft download site, you'll find the Public Instant Messaging Connectivity Provisioning Guide. It's about 7 or 8 pages of information that gives you an understanding of what you have to do in order to be able to connect out onto the internet. It's a process that you go through with Microsoft where they verify your credentials, they verify your licensing to make sure that you're compliant. So before you can connect out onto the internet and start communicating with instant messaging providers, we have to go through this PIC provisioning verification process. With Microsoft Lync, we also have support for mobile users. Mobile users refers to clients using smartphones or tablets running a Lync mobile client. It allows these clients to sign into the internal environment coming in through the reverse proxy server out in your DMZ. So our mobility services are advertised through the reverse proxy server to gain access to the Lync server environment internally. Our final category of external clients is the anonymous users. Anonymous users are users that do not have a user account within your environment, and they don't have a user account in a federated environment as well. These are users that have been invited to participate in a communication session. For example, if I send an invitation out to a lot of our partners and I invite them to an online meeting request with a conference, well, when these users go to connect in a lot of cases, they're not going to be authenticated users. One of the challenges that we have at Carverock Fitness is that we want to be able to use all of these features of Microsoft Lync, but we want to do it securely. We're going to be using Microsoft Lync for federation relationships, for traveling users, remote users, for public instant messaging connectivity, and we're also going to be using it extensively for conferencing with our partners. Let's take a look at the different pieces that are involved with setting up a secure Edge environment with Microsoft Lync. The first piece we have is our Edge servers. The Edge servers are Microsoft Lync servers that are installed out in your DMZ, and these are typically installed on standalone machines, machines that are not part of your internal forest, for security reasons. With Microsoft Lync 2013, the information on the edge services, or the configuration, gets replicated out to the edge server from the internal environment. So we configure the edge services on the internal servers, and then the settings replicate out to the edge server so they know how they're supposed to be configured. The edge services run three main services. The first service is called the Access Edge Service. The Access Edge Service is better known as your SIP service. It provides a connection point for both inbound and outbound session initiation protocol traffic. We also have the Web Conferencing Edge Service, and this service enables external users to join meetings that are hosted on your internal Lync Server 2013 environment. The third service is called the Audio Video Edge Service, and this makes audio, video, app sharing, and file transfer available to your external users. So when we're participating in conferences, we're able to share our applications, our desktop, we can transfer files, so we can use all of the collaboration features, even whiteboards and polling. A typical Lync Edge environment also requires a reverse proxy server. The reverse proxy server is used to gain access to web-based content. For example, when an external user in your organization connects in to gain access to download the address book, that's done through a reverse proxy. It's done through the web services. Another example will be expansion of distribution lists. Our reverse proxy server is going to have a lot of traffic coming through it that will get routed over to your front-end pool. Out in our DMZ, we have two firewalls. Well, Lync can be set up with a single firewall, but in our environment, we're going to have an internal firewall and an external firewall, and the Microsoft Lync server is going to be installed right between the two of them. Setting up your firewalls can be very challenging, but keep in mind that Microsoft Lync does have a planning tool that will aid you in the process of coming up with your firewall rules. It doesn't set up your firewalls for you, but it will give you the information you require for setting up your port rules. When we set up our Lync 2013 Edge environment, Microsoft only supports what's called a consolidated edge. A consolidated edge is a Lync Edge server that has all three services running on the edge server. So you don't have the ability to separate out your services to the different servers. If you're looking for a higher level of performance and availability, you can set up more than one edge server, but keep in mind that each edge server will run all three services: your Access Edge, the Audio Video, and the Web Conferencing Edge services. If you set up a single edge server out in your DMZ, you have to remember that that's a single point of failure. And if you are using a single edge server, you can use NAT or you can use publicly routable IP addresses. In order to achieve a higher level of availability for traffic coming in across the DMZ, you want to use at least a couple of edge servers in a pool. And if you set up multiple edge servers in a pool, we have to load balance the traffic to those servers. And Microsoft supports DNS-based load balancing and hardware-based load balancing. Just keep in mind that if you are going to use hardware-based load balancing, the IP addresses that you're using to represent your three services have to be directly routable. We cannot use network address translation for them. If we're using DNS-based load balancing, our IP addresses can be directly routable, or we can use network address translation. But if you are using NAT, it has to be one-to-one, one public IP address to one private IP address. With the prior version of Lync, Lync 2010, Microsoft had a role called the director. And traffic coming in across the edge server or your reverse proxy could take an extra hop through a director server role. So more specifically, this would handle SIP traffic coming in across the edge and web-based traffic coming in across your reverse proxy. And what the director did is provide an extra level of security for traffic coming in across the DMZ. It allowed us to pre-authenticate traffic before it got over to your front-end pool. So it provided me another layer of security against denial of service attacks. With Lync 2013, the director role still exists, but it's been de-emphasized for Microsoft. The edge design can be very challenging. Once again, the Lync planning tool is probably your #1 tool that you want to use to aid in the design process. The certificates that you have in your environment are going to have to support a lot of different names. You've got the name for your SIP service, the audio, video, and the web conferencing services. You've got the names out on your reverse proxy server, the name that you're using for your Meet Simple URL, the name that you're using for your Dial-In Simple URL. We also have to support the name that we're using to advertise our web services. All of these names are going to have to be incorporated into your certificate as subject alternative names. Again, don't get caught up in the details right now because the Lync planning tool is your #1 tool that will provide this information for you. You walk through a wizard and you provide the information into the planning tool, and when you're done, the planning tool will generate managerial reports with information regarding your certificate requirements, your DNS requirements, internally and externally, and also your firewall requirements. Let's take a closer look at the reverse proxy server. When we set up the Lync 2013 Edge environment, one of the requirements that we have is that we have to have a reverse proxy server for different types of web traffic coming in across the internet. What type of traffic is going to be serviced through the reverse proxy? The first type of traffic is your simple URL traffic. Now, you don't have to worry about the administrative simple URL. That's only used internally for gaining access to the control panel. We don't expose that to the internet. But we do have to make sure that the external DNS has the simple URL for dial-in, which is gaining access to the dial-in conferencing web page, and also for your meet simple URL, which is used to comprise the link used to join into the meetings. So when a client clicks on a link to join a meeting, the external DNS routes that traffic through the reverse proxy server, and the reverse proxy server can either route the traffic through a director role or directly over to the front-end pool. The reverse proxy server is also used for downloading meeting content. When a user goes to expand a distribution list, that traffic goes to the reverse proxy also, and then routes over to the web services running on your front-end pool. So the web services URL that you define when you set up your topology in your topology builder has to be exposed externally as a DNS entry. So when you define your web services URL inside of your topology builder and you publish that, when a client goes to connect into the web services, the DNS server on the internet has to be able to route that traffic over to the reverse proxy server, and then the reverse proxy server handles routing that traffic over to your front-end pool. At CarveRock Fitness, we have several users that will be working remotely, and when they go to download their address book, that information comes across the reverse proxy also. The device update services of Microsoft Lync allow IP-based phones to receive patches from the Microsoft Lync web services. Mobile devices will leverage off of the reverse proxy server to gain access to the mobility services and also for auto discovery. Let's take a closer look at adding the Edge server into our environment with the topology builder. Before we set up the Microsoft Lync Edge environment, it is required that you have your internal environment set up. Well, this is a requirement because in order to set up the Edge server, you have to export a copy of your topology out of the internal environment and then import it into the local system that you're setting up as an Edge. So as you'll see during the install demo, the Edge server does not have the ability to pull a copy of CMS directly from the environment. We're going to have to pull it in from an exported version of the content. To set up the Lync 2013 Edge environment, what you would normally do is come up with your design within the planning tool. You export a copy of your CMS out to a file, get that file over to the Edge server, and then you can use that as the import of your CMS out on the Edge. Inside of your topology builder, you have to add the Edge services environment into your topology and publish those changes back into CMS. So that way when you go to set up your Edge server and the install process looks to its local copy of CMS which we've imported, it will see its own server name in there and it will know that it's supposed to be set up as an Edge server. Let's take a look at how we add the Edge server into our topology by using the topology builder. In this demonstration, we're going to add a Microsoft Lync Edge server into our environment. So let's open up our topology builder. And when we open up the topology builder, we're going to download our topology from the existing deployment. And when we're prompted for the name of our topology file, we'll point to our existing tbxml file. We'll click on Save. Now from inside of the topology builder, we'll open up Lync Server 2013, open up our site called Scottsdale, and then as we navigate down, you can see that I have edge pools, and we're going to right-click and create a brand new edge pool. Click on Next. The name of my pool is going to be edgepool.carverockfitness.com. Now we're going to have multiple computers in our pool eventually, so let's click on Next. On the next property sheet, we select the features that we want to use with our edge pool. The first option, you can use a single FQDN and IP address for all three services, the Access Edge, the web conferencing, and the audio-video edge services. In our case, we're going to spread the traffic across three adapters so that we do not encounter a bottleneck with our conferencing traffic. We're also going to enable federation on port 5061, and this allows communication with our trusted federated partners. You'll also notice that with Lync Server 2013, Microsoft has added the XMPP support right into the edge servers and your front-end servers. With Lync Server 2010, you had to install the XMPP gateway as an additional feature, and you would install the XMPP gateway off of your OCS 2007 R2 installation media. Well, now it's built right into your front-end servers and your edge servers. If you're not familiar with the extensible messaging and presence protocol support, it's used by some of your instant messaging clients like Google Talk and Jabber. On our next property sheet, we select the IP options. You'll notice that we now have the ability to enable IP version 6 on the internal and the external interfaces. We can also determine if we want to use network address translation, and our IP addresses are going to be directly routable, so we don't need to choose the option to use network address translation on the external IP addresses. We'll click on Next again. On the next property sheet, we define the FQDNs that we're going to be using for our three services running on the edge server. My Access Edge service will be called sip.carverockfitness.com. You'll notice that I'm using port 443 for traffic coming in for SIP, as well as the 5061 traffic used for my Federation partners. Now, as I tab over, you can see that I have my web conferencing edge service, and here I'll call mine webconf.carverockfitness.com. Once again, I can still use port 443 because it doesn't cause a conflict since I'm using multiple adapters. If I was using a single adapter for all three of these services, I would have to route the traffic to different ports. I wouldn't be able to use port 443 for the Access Edge, the web conferencing, and the audio-video edge services. And since we have multiple IP addresses, this doesn't create a conflict for the server. And finally, we have the audio-video service, and we'll call this one avconf.carverockfitness.com. And once again, we're going to use port 443, and then we'll click on Next. Now, as I go through the process of defining the pool, I also have to specify the names of the servers that are in the pool. So let's click on Add. And you'll notice I have to specify the internal FQDN and IP address for the computer. So my internal IP address, which is going to be IP version 4, is 10.0.0.40. And for the internal FQDN, we'll use CRF for Carverock Fitness Edge 1.carverockfitness.com. We'll click on Next. I'll then specify the Access Edge Services IP addresses, and I have three IP addresses of 10.0.0.100, which is used for my Access Edge service. My web conferencing service is using 10.0.0.101, and my AP service has 10.0.0.102. Now, remember that my external DNS will have to have FQDNs that map down to these IP addresses, whether they're directly routable on the internet or if you're going through a reverse proxy. We'll click on Finish, and I've now got my CRF Edge 1 server added to my pool. And if I want to add additional servers at this point, I can click on Add, and then I can add them in also. If you were using a director pool, this is where you could click on the drop-down arrow, and you would be able to see your director pool here on the list. Now, our SIP traffic is going to go from the Edge server directly over to the front-end pool. We'll click on Next. On the next property sheet, we have the ability to associate our pools over with the Edge server for your media streaming traffic. So for external media traffic, do I want the traffic from pool.carverockfitness or my SBA, which is Mesa SBA, to go through this Edge server? Now, if you don't define this at this point, you'll be able to go back into your topology and you can define your associations later on if you choose to. I'm going to associate both of these with my new Edge environment. and then click on Finish. Now that I've defined my Edge Services environment inside of my topology builder, what I can do is publish my topology, or right-click, go down to Publish Topology, click on Next, and once again what I should be seeing here is a bunch of successful messages and a lot of green checks, so things went great. We're going to click on Finish, and then close out of the topology builder. Now let's take a look at installing the Edge server. Now that we have seen how to add the Edge environment into our topology with the topology builder, let's take a closer look at installing an Edge server. The primary task for setting up an Edge server is going to appear very similar to that of setting up a regular Lync server within your environment, although you will notice some key differences as I go through the demonstration. With your Edge server, you have an internal and you also have external interfaces. Well, at a minimum, you have to have one internal and one external interface. And you can also use multiple interfaces externally, one for each of your services. If you use a single IP address for your external interface, we have to route the traffic coming into the different services over different ports. If I use different IP addresses for each of the three services, then I can route traffic coming in over the three services over port 443. When we're setting up the Edge, you'll also see that I'll have to import a copy of CMS from a file, and then when I go to install my certificates, I'm going to have an internal certificate as well as a certificate for my external interfaces. As we go to set up the Edge server, the first thing we have to look at is our prerequisite software. This is no different than setting up a regular Lync server. You still have to go through your checklist and make sure that you have all the prerequisite software installed. We have to set up our interfaces for the network. Well, in our case, we're going to use 3 external and 1 internal. We have a lot of conferencing traffic that will be coming in across the Edge, and we don't want to bottleneck it through a single adapter. We then walk through the installation of the Edge server, and the Edge install process is going to look very similar to setting up a regular Lync server. You start by running your install and installing the core components, and then from inside of the deployment wizard, you'll install a copy of CMS from file, you'll then run the install certificates, and then start up your services. As we install the Edge server certificates, keep in mind that although Microsoft Lync does support internal private certificates coming from an internal trusted CA, we're going to be inviting a lot of partners to our conferences, and we're going to have to use a valid trusted certificate, a certificate trusted by clients out on the internet. So we're going to have to get a certificate from a trusted authority. Once we have our certificates installed, then it's just a matter of starting up the services and then making sure that it's working the way that it's supposed to be. Let's take a look at a demonstration on installing an Edge server. In this demonstration, we're going to see how to set up a Lync 2013 Edge server. Now, before I try to install the Edge server, I need to get a copy of my topology exported out to a zip file format from CMS, because my Edge server will not be able to pull a copy of CMS directly from the internal environment, because it's a standalone machine out in your DMZ. So what I'm going to do here is open up the Lync Server Management shell, and we'll use the export-cs configuration commandlet, and we'll export out to a file. We'll use the -filename option, and I'll export out to a file called config.zip. Next, we have to get that file over to the Edge server because we're going to need it as part of the installation process. So over here on my C drive, I have my config zip file. We're going to copy that and then transfer it across the network over to my other server. And we'll paste it on the C drive. And then as we go to install the Edge server, when we need to install CMS, we'll be able to pull it right from that zip file. Let's switch over to our other server that we're going to set up as our Edge server. We've just switched over to the Microsoft Lync 2013 Edge server. The next step, we're going to run the installation for Microsoft Lync to install the core components off of my D drive. So let's go to my D drive, and I'm prompted to install the Microsoft Visual C++ 2012 x64 minimum runtime support, so we'll click on Yes. And then when the installation of the core components is complete, the deployment wizard should open up automatically. On the next property sheet, I'm prompted for the installation location, and I'm going to stick with my default program files, Microsoft Lync Server 2013. Just keep in mind that additional components will be installed to the same directory in the future. We'll click on Install. Next, I accept the licensing agreement. We click on OK. And now you can see the core components getting installed, and then the deployment wizard should open up shortly. From inside of the deployment wizard, we don't have to worry about preparing Active Directory. That's already been done. But what we're going to do is click on Install or Update Lync Server Systems, and then we'll walk through the step-by-step installation process, with step number 1 being installing a local copy of the configuration store. As I go to install a local copy of the configuration store, we are not going to be able to connect to CMS directly. We're going to have to import that from our zip file. So let's go to step 1. We'll click on Run. You'll notice that my system detects that I'm set up as a standalone machine, a workgroup-based machine. So what I need to do is connect over to my C drive, and there you can see I have my local copy, my zipped version of CMS. We'll click on Next, and then all we have to do is sit back and watch the system install CMS. And then when the installation of CMS is complete, we can then kick off the next step, which is actually installing the Lync server. Great, now that I have installed a local copy of the configuration store, we'll move on to step number 2, which is installing Microsoft Lync. Okay, now we're ready to install Microsoft Lync. We'll click on Run. On the next property sheet, we'll click on Next. And then as you can see, the installation is very automated. The install looks to my local CMS copy, and then it installs based upon how my server is defined inside of CMS. So all we have to do now is sit back and watch the installation process proceed. Next, you can see that my component installation is completed, so we'll click on Finish. And then move down to step number 3, which is installing and assigning certificates. In the next step, we're going to request and assign certificates for both the internal and the external interfaces of the Lync Edge server. So as the certificate wizard opens up, you can see that I have 2 interfaces, and let's start off with the internal interface. We'll click on Request. Click on Next. And in our case, we're going to send the request immediately to the online CA, which is our internal certificate authority. Now, because I'm setting up a server out in the DMZ, this server is not able to automatically detect my internal CA. So what I have to do is define my CA. So let's type it in. And then we'll click on Next. On the next property sheet, I can specify credentials used to connect over to the server. And we'll put in our password. On the next property sheet, we can specify if we want to choose a specific type of certificate template. I'll click on Next. We then provide a friendly name for our internal certificate. I'll call mine Edge Internal. You'll notice that the bit length is set for 2048, and you can also specify if you want to mark that certificate private key as being exportable. Now, as we're setting up multiple servers in a pool, common practice would be to set up those certificates to be exportable so that you can install them across the multiple servers within the pool, because they're going to have to share the same namespaces. We then provide our country code, the state,
and next we provide the city information for Scottsdale. And then we will click on Next.
You can see that my system automatically populated my subject name with edgepool.carverockfitness.com. That's going to be the name of my pool. If I want to provide any additional subject alternative names, I would be able to define them here on the next property sheet. As you're coming up with the namespaces that you're going to request for your certificate, you really want to use your Lync planning tool as a guide, because with your planning tool, you can walk through a wizard where you provide information into the wizard, and when you're done, it will generate managerial reports for your DNS requirements, your firewall requirements, and your certificate requirements. We'll click on Next. You can see that we're requesting a certificate, and then when we're done requesting the certificate, we can launch into the certificate assignment wizard, which will apply that certificate to my Edge server. And then click on Finish. You can see that the certificate assignment wizard launches for me automatically. We'll click on Next. Next again. And then we'll click on Finish. Next we have to set up the external Edge certificate, so we'll select the certificate, Request, and I have a warning that pops up letting me know that if I'm setting up a pool of servers, you want to make sure that your certificate is exportable so that you can install that certificate across the servers in the pool. All the servers will support the same namespaces, so you want to make sure you incorporate all of the namespaces in as subject alternative names. Once again, you want to get this information from your Lync planning tool. Let's click on Yes. We'll click on Next. When you're setting up the external interfaces of the Edge server, you typically want to get a valid certificate from a trusted public authority. In this demonstration, I'm going to use a private certificate authority, but when we set up the Lync 2010 environment at Carverock Fitness, the external interface is going to have a certificate coming from a trusted authority. So when external clients try to connect into our environment coming in across the Edge, we're going to be using valid certificates that are trusted by your clients. We'll click on Next. Because I've already requested a certificate, I'm able to pull up my CA namespace without typing it in. We'll then specify the credentials to connect over to the CA. I'll put in my password. And then click on Next. We'll accept the default certificate template. My friendly name for this certificate will be External. My bit length is 2048, and I definitely want to make sure that that certificate is exportable
so that we can install it across other Edge servers within the pool.
On the next property sheet, you can see that my organization and organizational unit information
is pulled automatically from my prior certificate request.
Here I have my country, state, and city. Here we can see that my certificate request is pulling the subject name of the Access Edge service, sip.carverockfitness.com, and it's also pulling the subject alternative names from information that I've published into CMS. If you need to support any additional subject alternative names, you can provide them on the next property sheets. On the next property sheet, I can see the domain namespaces that I'm supporting for my Lync environment. And if I want these namespaces to be duplicated as a subject alternative name, I just select them and I click on Next. On the next property sheet, I can define any additional subject alternative names that I require for support on my Edge servers. I'll click on Next. Click on Next again. And then as I click on Next, once again, we're going to launch the assignment wizard. And then we click on Finish.
I now have a certificate assigned to the external interface of the Edge server.
Once I close out of the console, my next step is to start my services. We'll click on Next, and then Finish. And our last step would be verifying that your services are running.
And that they're installed.
So when I click on this link, it brings me over to my services applet. Then as you can see, I have my Microsoft Lync services, and some of these services are starting, some of them are started up already. So things look great. Now that the Edge services are installed and running, let's switch over to the control panel to see how to configure it. Now the control panel is not installed on the Edge server for security reasons, so we're going to switch over to our Lync front-end server. We've now switched over to the Lync front-end server, and we're going to open up our control panel and provide our credentials. And you'll notice in the control panel that we have Federation and External Access. The first policy is called External Access Policy, and this can be configured globally and at the site and user level. When we open it up, you'll see that we can enable communication with federated users, including the Extensible Messaging Presence Protocol federated users. We can also enable communication with remote users and public users, also known as anonymous users. On the Access Edge configuration, this is only configured globally. You can specify if you want to enable federation with public instant messaging connectivity. We can also enable partner domain discovery, so we can locate those federated partners by querying DNS and looking for SRV records. We can send archiving disclaimer messages so the partners know that we're archiving the content. We can also enable remote user access for convenience for the employees at Carverock Fitness, and we can enable anonymous user access to our conferences. But you have to remember that we can also configure that at the conference level as well. On the SIP federation domains, this is where we can define if we want to allow or block federation relationships with different domains. And if I click on either of these, here's where you can define your domain FQDN and your Access Edge Server FQDN. But the Access Edge Service FQDN can also be discovered through DNS. Underneath our SIP federated providers, this is where you can see our PIC providers such as AOL, MSN, Yahoo, and Lync Online. If we open these up, you'll see that you can enable communication with the provider, and you can also specify if you want to allow communication with all the clients from that provider, or if you want to limit that to our clients' contacts. You will also notice that Microsoft has provided us with an XMPP Federated Partners tab, and this is new with Lync 2013. This allows us to set up federation relationships with XMPP providers, such as Google Talk or Jabber. Well, I hope you've enjoyed the demonstration, and we'll see you in the next video.